The gymnasium at Fort Bragg in the summer of 1967 was a structure defined by its lack of comfort. It was a cavernous, functional space built of corrugated steel and reinforced concrete, designed to endure the heavy humidity of North Carolina and the constant, punishing use of thousands of soldiers. On this particular afternoon, the air inside felt thick and stagnant, barely moved by the massive overhead fans that rattled in their metal housings. The atmosphere was a heavy mix of industrial floor wax, the metallic tang of old sweat, and the faint, persistent smell of damp canvas and cleaning chemicals. Nearly 300 men from the 82nd Airborne and various Special Forces units sat on the wooden bleachers, their combat boots occasionally clattering against the planks as they shifted weight. They were a wall of olive drab, their arms crossed tightly over chests hardened by rucksacks and obstacle courses. These were men who viewed the human body strictly as a tool for labor or a target for destruction, and they looked down at the center of the mat with a collective, professional skepticism. Bruce Lee stood in the center of the pale gymnasium floor, appearing almost slight in comparison to the paratroopers. He wore a simple, dark tracksuit that was already showing signs of dampness from the heat. He didn't pace or engage in any theatrical warm-ups, he simply stood with his hands at his sides, his eyes scanning the bleachers with the detached observation of a mechanic inspecting a piece of machinery. There was no visible tension in his shoulders, and his weight seemed perfectly centered between his feet. Across from him stood Sergeant First Class Miller, a man who represented the pinnacle of the Army's combat philosophy at the time. Miller was a veteran of Korea and had served 2 tours in Vietnam. He was over 6 feet tall, with a neck that seemed to merge directly into his trapezius muscles and hands that were scarred and thickened from years of heavy bag work. To Miller, the demonstration felt like a diversion from real training, and he watched Bruce with a narrow-eyed gaze, his jaw set in a line of mounting irritation. The session began with a series of reaction drills designed to illustrate the concept of efficiency. Bruce asked Miller to stand in a standard defensive posture, guarding his torso with both hands. The instruction was clear and devoid of any martial arts mystique. Miller was to try and prevent Bruce from touching his chest. Bruce took a position about 4 feet away, settling into a stance where his right foot led and his weight was balanced on the balls of his feet. For several seconds, nothing happened. The soldiers in the bleachers watched Miller's eyes, which were locked onto Bruce's shoulders, waiting for the slight hitch that usually precedes a punch. Then, Bruce moved. There was no wind-up and no preparatory shift in his weight. His lead hand simply shot forward in a straight line, reaching top speed instantly. The sound of Bruce's knuckles tapping the center of Miller's chest was a sharp, dry snap. Miller hadn't even begun to lift his hands to block. Bruce reset and told him to try again. Miller tightened his guard, his muscles bunching as he focused entirely on the distance between them. Again, Bruce's hand flickered forward, and again, the tap landed on Miller's sternum before the sergeant could react. By the 5th or 6th repetition, the quiet murmurs from the bleachers had died away, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. The soldiers were no longer looking for a trick, they were watching the physics of the movement. They noticed that Bruce's head didn't move and his shoulders didn't dip. He was simply existing in the space where Miller's guard was not. Miller's face began to flush a deep, angry red. Every time Bruce's hand touched his chest, it felt like a public correction of his own competence. He could hear the faint squeak of Bruce's shoes on the mat and the rhythmic sound of the contact, and with every tap, his posture became more aggressive. He was no longer participating in a drill, he was becoming a coiled spring of frustration. The transition from a demonstration to a genuine physical conflict happened without warning. Bruce was in the middle of explaining the importance of a relaxed shoulder when Miller decided to break the unspoken rules of the engagement. He didn't wait for the next drill. Instead, he dropped his lead shoulder and threw a massive, professional-grade right hook. It was a punch backed by over 200 pounds of muscle and delivered with the full intent of a knockout. The proximity was too close for Bruce to fully evade, and the blow slammed into the side of his neck and the upper part of his shoulder. The sound of the impact was a heavy, sickening thud that echoed through the gym. Bruce was knocked sideways, his feet tripping over the edge of the safety mats as he fought to stay upright. He had to drop one hand to the floor to stabilize himself, his head snapping to the side from the shock of the strike. The gymnasium went deathly silent. The captain in charge of the session took a half step forward, his hand rising to end the demonstration, sensing that the situation had turned dangerous. Miller didn't back off. He stood over Bruce, his fists still clenched and a look of grim satisfaction on his face. He felt he had proven the only point that mattered in his world, that size and aggression could override any amount of technical speed. Bruce stayed in a semi-crouch for several seconds, his hand reaching up to touch the reddened skin of his neck where the pulse was visible. He didn't look shocked or angry, he looked focused, as if he were recalibrating his internal systems. When he stood up, the instructional tone of the afternoon was gone. His eyes were flat and cold, and his breathing had slowed into a deliberate, rhythmic pattern. He settled into a deeper stance, his lead foot shifting forward and his weight centering in a way that made him appear suddenly more grounded, more dangerous. "Again," Bruce said. His voice was no longer that of a teacher, it was the voice of a man engaging in a functional task. Miller, fueled by the success of his first strike, lunged forward again. He didn't try to box this time, he put his head down and charged, intending to use a tackle to drive Bruce into the bleachers. He wanted to use his mass to crush the smaller man against the concrete floor. Bruce didn't retreat. As Miller's weight surged toward him, Bruce executed a precise, 45-degree shuffle to his right. As Miller flew past, Bruce drove his lead heel into the side of Miller's thigh, just above the knee. It was a stop kick, a strike designed to kill momentum by targeting a structural weak point. The sound of the heel hitting the muscle was like a wooden bat hitting a side of beef. Miller's knee buckled inward, and his charge was abruptly redirected, sending him stumbling across the mat as he struggled to keep his balance. Miller scrambled to his feet, his face contorted in a snarl as he realized his bulk had been turned against him. He threw a desperate left jab, followed by a heavy right cross. Bruce moved into the pocket, the space inside Miller's reach, where most fighters feel most vulnerable. As the jab extended, Bruce used a slapping motion with his lead hand to deflect the punch across Miller's own body, effectively jamming Miller's right arm before it could even fire. In the split second that Miller's guard was obstructed, Bruce delivered a rapid series of straight punches to Miller's face. These weren't wide, swinging blows, they were short, piston-like strikes delivered with a vertical fist. They caught Miller on the bridge of the nose and the cheekbones with a repetitive, mechanical rhythm. Blood began to leak from Miller's nose, spraying in fine droplets onto the white mat as his head snapped back with each impact. Driven by a mix of pain and adrenaline, Miller tried to clinch, hoping to wrap his arms around Bruce's waist and use his wrestling experience to neutralize the speed. Bruce dropped his center of gravity, sinking his weight into his hips to absorb the initial force of the collision, then he exploded upward. He drove the heel of his palm directly into Miller's solar plexus. This was not a tap for a demonstration, it was a full-body strike that utilized the ground as a fulcrum. The impact was so precise that Miller's diaphragm paralyzed instantly. The sergeant's mouth opened in a wide, silent gasp as his lungs failed to draw in air. He collapsed forward, his head dipping, and as he fell, Bruce delivered a short-range hook to the floating ribs. The sound of the rib fracturing was a dull, internal crack, muffled by the sergeant's thick fatigues. Miller hit the mat on his side, his hands clutching his midsection as he rolled, his face turning a pale, sickly shade of gray. The silence in the gymnasium was total. The paratroopers in the bleachers sat frozen, watching their lead instructor, a man they had viewed as an immovable force, lying in a heap on the floor, unable to breathe. Bruce stood in the center of the mat, his breathing regular and his posture calm. He wasn't celebrating or looking for the crowd's reaction. He was simply waiting for Miller to regain his feet. After nearly a minute of ragged, painful wheezing, Miller was helped up by two other NCOs. He stood hunched over, his hand pressed firmly against his side, his face a mask of shock and profound realization. The aggression that had started the fight had been entirely drained out of him, replaced by a quiet, professional respect. He looked at Bruce, wiped the blood from his nose with the back of his hand, and gave a short, stiff nod. No words were exchanged, but the shift in the room was undeniable. The captain finally found his voice and tried to restore order, but the formality of the demonstration had dissolved. The soldiers didn't wait for permission, they stood up as one and moved toward the mat, forming a tight, respectful circle around Bruce. They were no longer looking at him as an outsider or a guest. They were looking at a man who had just demonstrated a level of physical reality they had never encountered. The questions that followed were practical and urgent. They wanted to know how to move without tipping off the opponent, how to generate power from such a short distance, and how to maintain balance under pressure. Bruce spent the next several hours working with them, moving through the rows of olive-drab soldiers and correcting their stances with hands-on precision. He showed them that their heavy boots and thick uniforms were tools, but only if they understood the mechanics of the body inside them. The instructional phase that followed was not a lecture on philosophy, but a rigorous breakdown of human biomechanics. Bruce moved through the rows of sweat-soaked soldiers, stopping to physically adjust the position of a corporal's elbow or the angle of a sergeant's lead foot. He explained that a punch, when executed with maximum efficiency, does not originate in the shoulder or the arm, but begins with the friction of the lead heel against the floor. He demonstrated how kinetic energy travels upward through the legs, is amplified by the rapid rotation of the hips, and is finally released through a limb that remains entirely relaxed until the microsecond of impact. To prove the point, he had several men throw their heaviest, military-style, punches at a training pad, then showed them how much more force was generated when the arm was treated as a whip rather than a club. He repeated the mantra that tension is the ultimate enemy of speed, a muscle that is already contracted cannot explode. In a real engagement, he noted, the person who tries the hardest, who tenses their jaw and bunches their shoulders in an effort to manhandle the opponent, is almost always the one who loses their breath and their balance first. He spent nearly an hour stripping away the perceived mystery of his movements, showing the men the cold physics behind the stop hit and the economy of motion. He showed them that by moving even 3 inches less than their opponent, they gained a massive temporal advantage. He demonstrated how to interact with an incoming strike by occupying the center line, making it physically impossible for the opponent's blow to reach its target. The gym, which had begun the day in a state of restless, mocking noise, was now filled with a different kind of sound, the rhythmic, disciplined scuffle of hundreds of combat boots on the mats and the collective thud of fists hitting pads. The men were no longer looking for flaws in Bruce's performance, they were intensely focused on the mechanical flaws in their own. The air was thick with the heat of 300 bodies working in unison, the earlier skepticism entirely replaced by a quiet, grim dedication to mastering a more lethal way of moving. As the afternoon light began to fade, the sun dipped low over the North Carolina pines, casting long, sharp-edged orange shadows through the high, dust-streaked windows of the gymnasium. The corrugated steel of the roof creaked as it cooled, a stark contrast to the stifling heat still trapped on the floor. Bruce finally called an end to the session, his tracksuit now heavy with sweat and clinging to his frame. As he gathered his few belongings and made his way toward the exit, the dark, purple bruise on his neck had become much more prominent, a vivid physical record of the force Miller had exerted in that first unexpected strike. The captain walked beside him, his boots clicking rhythmically on the concrete perimeter of the gym. He paused at the door, looking back at the mats where the training was supposed to have ended. Despite being dismissed, dozens of men, including Miller, remained. The sergeant was hunched over but moving through a slow-motion version of the footwork Bruce had used to collapse his charge, his face set in a mask of total concentration while a group of younger paratroopers watched him closely. The captain remarked that in all his years at Fort Bragg, he had never seen a room of career soldiers so completely silenced or so focused a guest instructor. He seemed to be searching for a way to categorize what he had just witnessed, whether it was a new form of boxing or something else entirely. Bruce didn't offer a dramatic summary or a grand philosophical conclusion. He stood by the heavy exit doors for a moment, looking at the bruise on his neck in the reflection of the glass, and simply noted that a fight is a living, shifting thing that changes every half-second. He told the captain that the only way to survive that kind of chaos is to be more honest than the opponent, to stop pretending you are stronger than you are and instead focus on being exactly where the opponent is not. It was a practical observation, offered without ego, before he stepped out into the cooling evening air. He walked across the gravel parking lot to his car, leaving the smell of sweat and floor wax behind. As he drove toward the main gates of the base, the story of what had happened on that mat was already beginning to circulate through the barracks and mess halls. It was a story that would be told and retold for decades, often exaggerated and changed as it passed from one generation of soldiers to the next. Some would say he moved like a ghost, others would claim he hit with the force of a truck. But for the 300 men who had actually been in the room, the lesson remained grounded in the hard, physical reality of the exchange they had seen. They had witnessed the moment where the appearance of massive, muscular strength was systematically dismantled by the reality of precise, mechanical power. They had learned that the most dangerous person in the room is rarely the one with the loudest voice or the most imposing physique, but the one who has mastered the cold, quiet art of being in the right place at the right time. As Bruce's car cleared the perimeter and disappeared into the North Carolina night, the gymnasium behind him remained a scene of intense, private labor, as 300 men began the long process of rethinking everything they thought they knew about how a human being actually fights.